Hello, I'm Lester Kiewit.
And I'm Tara Roos.
And welcome to The Bull. It's the show where we talk politics, parliament, and pop culture. Tara, let's just get straight into it. It's been a very energetic week in the political front, geopolitical front. We'll tackle a little bit about what was the third attempt at the budget, and we're going to be talking about in pop culture about performative politics and whether the youth appreciates that. But what was the last week like for you?
Exhausting. I haven't had a single moment's peace since the 19th of February when the budget wasn't first tabled. But, third time's the charm. So.
Okay, so a lot of our attention and a lot of the world's media attention wasn't in a budget lockup. It was in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. It was Cyril Ramaphosa trying to de-escalate tensions, restore functional and respectful relationships with the United States and U.S. President Donald Trump. Was this a case of strategic diplomacy, or Cyril Ramaphosa saying, hey, I also have white friends, by pulling in two professional golfers and South Africa's richest man in the... I'd like your first takeaways. Firstly, what were we doing there? What was it that South Africa wanted? And did the meeting in the Oval Office, did it move the needle in any way?
Look, I think Cyril going to the United States right after the 49 defectors fled and claimed themselves as refugees, it definitely was a timely decision. I think the intention was the renewal of AGOA, and the renewal comes up now in June. AGOA is about to expire, and I think that is at the forefront of cabinet, the president's mind. John Steenhuisen, specifically as the Minister of Agriculture, but also Julius as the leader of the DA, has been talking about AGOA non-stop. And I think that was the intention of the chip, and to open the lines of communication, because a lot of things have been said over the internet. Donald Trump has Elon Musk in his ear, who does not have the most favorable opinions on South Africa at large. And I think Ramaphosa was going there to clear up any misconceptions. What it turned into was a complete spectacle in which I think Donald Trump tried to show his presence and make sure that he is seen as this triumph for white farmers in South Africa who are under mass persecution. I think when he dimmed the lights in the Oval Office and he started playing those videos, myself and every other South African who was astute and was just, we were in complete and utter shock. Do I think that this was a productive conversation? No. I don't think that we are any step closer to renegotiating the terms of AGOA, if not renegotiating the current agreement, looking at a new bilateral trade agreement between South Africa and the United States. I think this was just an opportunity for Donald Trump to showcase to Cyril Ramaphosa that he was the bigger president in the room.
Look, it was a period in South African and American relations, the lowest ebb that we find ourselves. But what are the issues? There's AGOA, there's the 49 resettlers, there is the right-wing MAGA talking points of which Donald Trump is speaking to his base, South Africa against Israel on the ICJs. Is there anything I'm missing? Because this is a laundry list of things that have not gone right between South Africa and the US just over the last 4 or 5 years.
Look, you could throw BRICS in there. Also the push for de-dollarization, that's also another big talking point. The issue I have with South African diplomacy at large, and I say this as someone who is extremely patriotic about this country, is we don't know where we want to be. We'll say that we're a neutral broker when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but then vote with Russia at the UN. We are in bed with China, but we want a trade deal with the United States. South Africa, we take Israel to the ICJ, but we're still exporting coal to Israel. So there are many arbitrary lines in which South Africa does not have a stern ideological position. And what the government is communicating versus what the government actually does are two completely different things. And I do think right now it's a pivotal time to decide, are we a United States ally or are we going to be an adversary? And I do think that coming home from this trip, that is going to be the main talking point.
But you don't have to be either or.
In Donald Trump's world, you do.
But Donald Trump is best friends with Vladimir Putin, had a 2-hour phone call with Vladimir Putin the day before Cyril was in the White House. South Africa partners with Iran on various agricultural exports, also in previously the exploration of nuclear as an energy source. The United States is currently involved in negotiations, trade, and a nuclear deal with Iran. Several countries and several entities. South Africa, or the ANC, is friendly to Hamas, but Donald Trump accepts a $400 million plane gift from Qatar, who literally funds Hamas. So where's the double standards here?
I think the bottom line comes down to is how does America benefit in all of those situations? Is that they're willing to bend the rules as and when they see fit in order to make sure that they are the biggest benefactor out of any deal that happens. As it currently stands, look, the United States, and I maintain this, if they would like to hold their strategic geopolitical position, specifically within the context of Africa, they need South Africa. They could fill the gap when looking at AGOA and the valuation that we bring into the country. Like, you can get citrus elsewhere, you can get nuts and automotive parts elsewhere. South Africa also needs the US. It is a beneficial relationship. But the question is, who is going to blink first? And I think, it was quite stark for me to see, like, never in my life did I think I would see Johan Rupert get on almost quintessentially his knees and be like, please, Mr. President, we need you. I do also think that Elon Musk plays a very interesting role. Just hours before the infamous White House showdown, he was giving an interview talking about J-Space laws, talking about BEE, how Starlink is not able to be established in South Africa because they don't meet the BEE requirements. Whether or not the president decides to fold on Starlink and their BEE requirements, especially now with the signing of the new Employment Equity Act, is going to be extremely interesting. But right now, as it stands, bringing back to my initial comment about ally versus adversary, I don't think that there is a way to be in a mutually beneficial with the United States currently. I think that there is no country that the United States sees as an equal partner. I don't see any likelihood of how that could be South Africa. And I do think that it's a very dangerous game because, like we've seen with Donald Trump, he will bend the rules as and when he sees fit.
Because here's the thing, second largest trading partner, 4% of our agricultural output actually in fact goes to the United States. But the thing is, the US knows what its national interest is.
Yeah.
So whether there's a Republican president or whether there's a Democratic president, the institution of the United States, through its Congress, its business, knows what the United States national interest is. What is South Africa's national interest? Do you know?
Look, and this also ties into the budget when we look at South Africa does not have enough economic or fiscal wiggle room at the moment. There is a big debate about whether or not we could cut the US off completely. Completely is very unlikely. If AGOA had to fall through, it would take some time, but we could fill the gap. We could look into the EU, into BRICS, we could restructure the African Free Trade Agreement. There are ways in which South Africa could economically fill that hole. Whether or not geopolitically that is a smart decision, I think is a completely different conversation. But what I don't think is helpful and or productive, and I have quite a strong pushback by some of the comments that were being made by the professional golfers in the room, is almost buying into this idea that there is somewhat a basis for white genocide. White people die in this country, so do black people, so do colored people. Death is sad, but it is not special towards white victims.
Okay, so let's then talk about that strategic diplomacy. What did Cyril Ramaphosa do to push that needle, push back a little bit, but also placate Donald Trump? So what he said in the beginning was, there is no white genocide. We have an issue with crime. And you know what, Mr. President? We use US technology to help fight crime in South Africa. Drones and shot spotter technology. I don't think Donald Trump, and you could see Donald Trump saying, oh. Is it? Really? And that's what Cyril Ramaphosa was actually quite good at in this meeting, saying we have a strategic and economic relationship. Also naming companies like Sasol, Aspen, who are invested in the United States, actually contributes to American jobs there. So that was quite strategic in drawing this economic link, even though South Africa is a small player, but an economic link that shows that South Africa and the US shares a destiny. That was quite interesting.
Cyril is a master negotiator. He has many skills, but I think that is at the top of them. The problem that comes in when looking at Donald Trump has a single viewpoint. I mean, I would be so fascinated to see every single article that he pulled up, and I actually wish that they projected that video of the crosses and the grave sites that they were displaying, because I would struggle to see where all of those articles come from. Because the thing is, when you look at, I mean, even with the defectors of the 49 refugees, I mean, yesterday Donald Trump was referencing, hundreds of thousands of white people fear for their lives and they're looking to leave to their country and they're leaving in droves to Australia and to the US. And that is just simply not true. Those are non-facts.
South Africans are leaving.
Yes.
In fact, if we were to go through the statistics, you see that more black South Africans are moving for economic reasons, and that is absolutely their right. In fact, I endorse people go see the world, particularly young South Africans. If you feel that the opportunities are limited in the scope and field that you maybe have trained and studied for, go abroad. The Constitution allows you to have dual citizenship. But on facts and Donald Trump, it was quite clear. Facts weren't going to move.
Yeah, no.
In fact, it was quite interesting that Cyril Ramaphosa gave a gift of a book.
Of a book.
Because
showing all the Gulf estates.
Well, Donald Trump clearly doesn't read, so we hope it's a picture book. Because one of those articles, the AFP fact checker website, reported that one of those articles was actually a blog post with a picture of incidents in the DRC. So it wasn't a case of going to try and convince Donald Trump to change his mind and to counter him with facts, because he doesn't need facts to try and rile up a base. Whether you go there with saying, this is all the facts, this is the context, this is the reality, it's not going to change his mind, because he needs to speak to a local base by using international concerns. But let's then talk about the presence, the role of the golfers. And let's be honest, what do you give to a crying child? You give their favorite toys. The favorite toys of Donald Trump is, of course, fellow millionaires and professional golfers.
Yes and no. I think that a better diplomatic front would to have had all the leaders of the GNU, all the political party leaders. Peter Groenewald, I maintain, should have been there. And I think specifically as an Afrikaan leader who sits on the right of the political spectrum in South Africa, who is working inside the GNU, I think that would have been a powerful message. What I don't like was a comment that was made where it was like, we are 30 years into democracy and two wrongs don't make a right. That was something that I think specifically not just rubbed me the wrong way, but it's just simply a non-narrative in South Africa. Like Donald Trump was talking about how white people's heads were being chopped off and their land was being taken away. Not a single piece of land has been expropriated without compensation in South Africa. That is a fact. And when looking at not only how Donald Trump is dialing up his base to then in America have a distant view of South Africa, we're also looking at how internally amongst a very small percentage of white South Africans are now looking and saying, we have garnered international support for our faux cause. It's not productive to the larger multicultural nation building that we should be doing in South Africa.
There were, Ernie Els and his remembrance to thank the United States for support during
Angola.
The border war. That is Ernie Els and particularly white men of his generation, their remembrance. I, of course, have white male friends who were conscientious objectors. They were part of the ECCN conscription campaign. I equally have older white male friends who did service, and they did go to the border. It frames their worldview. So I don't know if it's about remembrance or trauma, but that is a reality of a part of South Africa, which I think we kind of have to accept, just as I accept the trauma of maybe a black man of the same age as Ernie Els, but who experienced the SADF in the townships. That is the South African experience. And that that I appreciate. But what I appreciate even more is even a Ernie Els or a Retief Goosen or Johan Rupert saying, we are South Africans. We appreciate that what happens to South Africa on a macro level, like, for example, the removal of AGOA, would affect the 56% of South Africans who live below the poverty line. So maybe some critique on the message, but the fact that they were there to deliver a message, well, maybe I can appreciate that.
I can appreciate their presence there. Similarly, I can appreciate some of John Steenhuisen's comments. Something that I thought was so interesting when talking about the large-scale crime in South Africa, how Johan Rupert turned to John Steenhuisen and said, you would admit this, but violence on the Cape Flats, where the DA jams the province, is rampant. And John just sat there and John was like...
Johan Rupert was, now that we're talking...
now that we're here.
now that we're here, let me tell you.
And John was like, yeah. And I think, there is something to be said about this narrative. We're 30 years in. Like, I keep on coming back to that because it's almost under this impression that, we got democracy 30 years ago, but overnight, all the white people who voted for the National Party, who were racist, who were supporters of apartheid, didn't wake up the day after the election and the ANC got into power and said, oh, we are all here for one South Africa, let's build a rainbow nation. Racist white people do exist. And the trauma that was inflicted and the consequences that was inflicted by apartheid is still present. But I do think this idea that two wrongs don't make it right, affirmative action policies and reduced economic measures cannot even come close and be comparable to what the apartheid system was.
Before we get out, what would be the best outcome on a reset on relations? The big winner of the night, Julius Malema.
Yes.
Julius Malema gets flung onto the world stage. He has no purpose currently in the Oval Office. He is the leader of the party with the fourth largest representation in the National Assembly.
Only 9%.
9%. But because of Donald Trump flung now into global attention, what then that does is he becomes a torchbearer for the millions of disaffected, dissatisfied young Africans, whether it's the EFF branch in Namibia, whether it is young people upset with their own governments and largely also has an impact on Western monetary policy, whether it is young people in East Africa, they now see Julius Malema irritates Donald Trump. And you know what? We like this guy. Julius Malema was the biggest winner.
I wonder, I would have paid to have seen Floyd's reaction to that when they dimmed the White House, the Oval Office lights, and then Julius Malema was projected. And I think, look, Donald Trump made an interesting point. He was like, you know what, there's like hundreds of thousands of people in that stadium. So, I mean, you talk about in the first episode, they bus people into those stadiums, and the EFF is only 9%. But it goes to show that while I think in the political landscape, a lot of people following the 2024 election have written Julius Malema and the EFF off completely. But that is something to be said, that he still holds such a grasp on the Western imagination and what they think that is the projection of South African politics. I do think that this will do positive things for his popularity. Whether or not he can ride the wave from this is yet to be seen.
There is this formation of the angry black African bogeyman, not just with Julius Malema, but also someone like Ibrahim Traore.
Yeah. And when you look at the idea of the fact, I mean, land expropriation without compensation, which has been an EFF talking point since inception, that hasn't even happened yet. So if the mere thought of land expropriation without compensation could rile Donald Trump up so much, what is going to happen when land is expropriated for public interest in South Africa, or we take any of our redress and affirmative action policies further?
Okay, so what are takeaways? What would be considered wins for the South African government? Look, I think AGOA is already off the table. South Africa originally was not supposed to be part of AGOA. It was for small emerging African economies, South Africa, along with Egypt, Nigeria, African economic powerhouse. But because of South Africa's location, the reliance of countries like Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, Lesotho, it becomes a hub using our infrastructure. So South Africa says, well, we have to be part of AGOA because all these things will come through our ports. We've already had disputes from Obama's time already. Something almost as frivolous as chicken would have scuppered AGOA. I think the United States has already, very, very long ago, long before Donald Trump, has already decided to call time on AGOA. And I think many people, particularly within South African agriculture and other processing, realizes AGOA is not going to be renewed.
I don't think AGOA will be renewed either. I do think that it's dead in the water. I specifically think that there are government departments. I know the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Trade Industry are looking at safety measures to put in place when it falls through. What we do need to be looking at economically, though, is tariffs. Specifically, that 31% tariff that Donald Trump said he would implement. And I mean, the idea that it's a reciprocal tariff, it is not. But we need to make sure that the tariffs are also scrapped, because having AGOA go is one thing, but having that plus tariffs, I think, would be really detrimental to South African economic relations with the US.
Is the reports of South Africa willing to grant Elon Musk Starlink licenses? Is that a concession, or is that a opening of a regulatory framework, particularly for ICT? Look, the blockage was that Elon Musk did not want to have a South African Starlink subsidiary have 30% black ownership. What has happened before is something called an equity equivalent. And there have been other companies, particularly in the motor manufacturing sector, who've already said that the corporate rule says we can't sell any parts, but what we're going to do, we're going to build local schools, we'll build the roads, we'll create the jobs, we're going to give a couple of things for free, which is a token but also a gesture of investment.
Yeah.
The problem is that we already have companies from the Middle East, for China, who've already started, who have not done equity equivalent deals. They've done BEE deals. Is the approval of Starlink, or the reported approval of Starlink, is that a concession? Is that a bend?
I do think it's a topic of discussion. Johan Rupert would have not mentioned it in the meeting publicly yesterday if that wasn't something that I think internally was also being pushed by South Africa. Starlink, whether or not it could be beneficial to South Africa at large and looking at internet connectivity, I think that is, I mean, it's a conversation for a different day. I would be very wary about looking at how US-South Africa relations have gone currently and giving Elon Musk that level of control, and also looking at security interests for South Africa at large to have him operate currently, given the current geopolitical tensions.
Because Starlink needs South Africa more than South Africa needs Starlink. They are these, it's called points of processing, whereas Starlink, being a satellite-based internet provider, they need ground points. Coverage in the US, coverage in South America, Europe, the Middle East, Australia, North Africa, but very few sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa. Elon Musk needs these points of processing in Southern Africa to have his invention, his company work more effectively. But then you also remember a couple of weeks ago, Reuters, New York Times, ProPublica reporting that the US State Department cables saying that if you're negotiating with a country, push Starlink. If you're negotiating tariffs with Gambia, Lesotho, if they want to lower tariffs, push Starlink. That is classic capture, with Elon Musk being Donald Trump's biggest political donor.
When you look at Elon Musk's views on South Africa specifically, I think, I mean, there was that incident like a week ago on Twitter where the AI chatbot on Twitter was just talking about white genocide and perpetuating lies of white genocide. And Elon Musk vehemently believes that there is a mass exodus of white people, and specifically white farmers. I don't think that Starlink operating in South Africa inherently is a good idea.
Elon's dad's still in Langebaan. I wonder when he's leaving.
Yeah. And I think, I don't think that is, I don't think that it's the best interest of the country, specifically looking from a state security perspective. However, economically, if that is what it is going to take to have tariffs scrapped, it might be a trade-off.
And finally, would it be a win? Certainly would, if Donald Trump eventually says, and I believe he will, say, okay, you know what?
There's no white genocide.
It's no white genocide, but I'm coming to the G20.
I think he will come to G20.
He's going to come.
He's going to come. I mean, he made a comment last night, without the US, like we are the originators of the G7 and the G20. And, Donald Trump loves to have his ego stroked.
That was clever of Cyril saying, you're the founder of and you have to be there. And you know what? We're handing over to you. So actually, this is your G20.
Yes, it's you. And he will be there in November. I do think it will be really interesting. And the content, because Donald Trump is a glorified influencer. The content he's going to be producing when he comes to South Africa, I want to know if he's going to go to those grave sites that he showed in his videos, if he's going to go meet with the white farmers. I want him to, I would love to see Donald Trump driving on the roads of Sandton.
Okay, let's move on to Parliament now. A story on the same day as the meeting of Cyril and Donald was the third iteration, the third bite of the cherry of the budget speech, which got neutral market reaction, largely because of what was said on Wednesday was said before, bar the exclusion of 8.5% VAT. It's likely to be passed. Why I know this budget was going to sail through? No leaks.
Yep. No leaks whatsoever. What I think was interesting, look, the budget stayed 95% the same from budget 2.0 to budget 3.0. The only big thing was that there was major cuts to infrastructure when we looked a lot at social spending and our borrowing rates, and there was a major cut in projection and VAT and income projection for the next fiscal year. Something that I thought that was really interesting was the tone. Godongwana got up there, despite the budget being 95% the same, he was echoing almost a lot of the DA's rhetoric and the DA's, I wouldn't say demands, but what they had been championing all along for the budget. Even specifically at the end, he thanked his two deputy ministers. He said many hands make the load lighter. And just his overall tone, he looked a lot less stressed, a lot less under pressure. And going into budget, even being in budget lockup yesterday, everyone, we were tired. When you walked into the CTICC, from the journalists to the MPs to all the staffers, we were just can you table this budget and can we leave? Because we're done with this now.
Yeah. No, because it's a process that has to move on. I think provincial or ministries have up until, I think it was the end of June. To pass, to have budgets pass so that the departments can run. If it doesn't pass,
they would only operate on 10%.
And as Godongwana said, there's no wage bill that's below 10%. So it would actually mean the shutting down of services. But when you talk about policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, I believe if you have two sheets of paper with the key economic and fiscal policy points of two unidentified parties, no one would be able to tell the difference if it's an ANC or a DA document.
There are massive, and this is a large unpopular opinion, I was for that increase. I think from a fiscal standpoint, it made the most logical sense. Because right now, all South Africa is doing, when you read the budget, we're just kicking the can down the road. Even in the budget, it explicitly states that they are going to look at increasing tax measures in 2026 because we need to raise an extra 20 billion. They're increasing funding to SARS, and National Treasury gives this large projection. They're saying they're going to increase funding to SARS because they're hoping SARS could find between 20 to 50 billion in the next financial year in taxes, because they believe that there are ineffective tax revenue collection mechanisms where the 20 to 50 billion, firstly a 30 billion deficit between those two numbers is insane, but where they're going to find the money, I would love to know.
And that tax debt isn't coming from average households who pay as you earn tax. A lot of that comes from corporate tax. It comes from offshore. It should be the targeting of those who are squirreling away offshore money that should go to Rome.
And that's simply not going to happen. The government is not going to implement a large-scale wealth tax. And so giving SARS more money is going to increase efficiency, but it is not going to allow for a massive surplus of revenue.
A minimal focus for youth employment, largest youth unemployment in the world, not in education or any form of job, 15 to 25, or something like 42%. We have 800,000 new job seekers enter the labor force every single year. We are going at just over 1% in economic growth. We need, at the very minimum, 4% economic growth just to absorb those 800,000 new job seekers. Does this budget do any of that?
Not even close. And the big issue that we now face is that we're going to be operating in a budget deficit. We operated in a budget deficit last year. It will most likely happen again this year. And the current National Treasury was really over-projecting. The last budget had as projected growth being at 0.82%. Now they've brought it down to 0.7%. In reality, we're only looking at about 0.5%. That is nowhere close to being able to stabilize our debt to GDP ratio. And when you look at the widening gap between our borrowing costs every single day and what we're spending just for debt servicing, it's astronomical. The problem is, and I fight really, and this is a big point of contention now with the fuel levy increase, is that a lot of people are saying, you know what, this is going to detrimentally affect the poor. And it is, because, you know, you'll see the cost of food going up, we will see the cost of petrol rising, and that affects absolutely everything. But I fight strongly against this narrative that the government is anti-poor. When you look at, for every rand that we spend, about 61 cents goes to social services. And I think more, and that is extremely important. I'm all for, I think, the social welfare state. I think the social welfare state is important, but we do not have enough measures in place for economic growth. The economy is not growing, and we are going to find ourselves in this exact same position in October when we get to medium term. We're going to find ourselves in this exact same position again next March when we get to 2026, and they will most likely have to increase that. And I think that increasing that, it was the quickest way to have a larger source of income come into the country and to look at large-scale measures that weren't drastically detrimental.
The budget speech or the budget process is a collection of various bills that gets tabled. The reason why the budget has not been passed in the previous two iterations, one, because budget was postponed. Secondly, is because there was simply not enough votes. There was a fiscal framework that included a 0.5% VAT increase that was then overturned by the courts, essentially. It now has to go to various votes. The GNU, the collective of, I forget, 9-10 parties. Sometimes you don't know because there's
12 of them.
Substitute 12 of them now. Is Action SA now officially in the GNU? Regardless, it's going to get the political support to get 50 plus 1.
When the DA is on board, anything will pass. As long as the DA and the ANC are in agreement, they're fine. I do think that the initial, VAT increase, the ANC going to get votes outside of the GNU, I think that this has strengthened the GNU. So at the end of the day, I mean, I think that the South African public is losing out because we are going to be in a greater financial crisis. You cannot grow the economy by cutting money to infrastructure. That's not how economic growth works. But Action SA is the biggest loser at the end of the day.
I've maintained if there is no tangible improvement in people's lives by the end of this year, people will judge. The most vulnerable of South Africans will judge this GNU. Not just the ANC, not just the DA, but all of the parties that are affiliated. And this then poses the question, with local government elections looming in 2026, if there's no tangible improvement in people's lot, could mean some form of electoral embarrassment, particularly the major parties, DA, ANC. We're already seeing the attraction of smaller niche language, cultural, identity-based parties. And that should be a warning. This should be a warning. This budget should be a warning that there is no tangible betterment in people's lives in the next 6 to 9 months. It's going to have an impact on parties in the GNU, maybe not the Patriotic Alliance, because it's been part of the very loud niche-based demographically inclined parties, but particularly the ANC and the DA could suffer from this.
The ANC will suffer come local government for two reasons. Specifically, I think while there's a national consensus that right here, right now, the ANC is probably the best party to have national control. Locally, they don't do local politics. While they're doing horrifically at a provincial level, terribly at a local government level, something that the smaller parties specifically, and the DA really champion this idea, and they do well, is that anyone could be a councillor. And you see a lot more vested interest from volunteers on the ground because they stand something to gain. Because, I mean, what a PR seat, you only need like 3,000 votes. And so you'll see a better large-scale interest for smaller political parties. But when it comes to the cohesion of a national identity and national unification, I do think that while the smaller parties like Rise and Action will grow in 26 or February of 2027, which is the latest the election can happen, I think that they will struggle in 29.
As we wrap up this, but connected to the conversation around Donald Trump in the White House, John Stienes and Cyril Ramaphosa, Julius Malema being brought into national limelight, but also a mention of the MK party.
Yeah.
Are we seeing a fast track because of internal influences and external influences on something of a more, should I say, permanent arrangement between the ANC and the DA?
Yes, I do think so. Specifically because of John Stienes' comments in the White House yesterday, when he did get eventually his turn to speak, he made, I don't want to say he pushed a DA narrative, but he very much championed the talking points of the Doomsday Coalition. And this idea that this is why we as the Democratic Alliance joined with the ANC, because we cannot prevent this from happening. And it was almost like and it really spoke to the DA's voting base to say, oh my gosh, no, now we need to go out in our Joes to the DA because we could never let them come into power. And I think that there is going to be, specifically with the DA's electoral conference coming up, internal electoral conference coming up in 26, and then the ANC in 27, I think that there is going to be a more tactical arrangement going into the next coalition come 29 than we saw in 24.
Because neither the ANC or the DA is going to get above 50% in a very, very, very long time. Okay, let's get to pop culture in politics. And this week, from Cyril Ramaphosa's golf diplomacy to Trump's Oval Office theatrics, this week offered a masterclass in political spectacle. But before we get there, something that happened last week, the premiering of Showmax's The Roast of Helen Ziller. Have you watched?
I have watched it. Have you?
And? Exactly, that's my answer. And?
It was really good. Look, I don't know, her comms team did really well. I mean, they wrote her jokes for her. I doubt this was her speaking from herself. I thought her jokes were really funny. I think it would be really interesting. I would love to see roasts of other politicians, but you see the commercialization of politics now at a larger landscape. I mean, everyone wants their viral moment, and it links strongly to the rise of populism in politics, and specifically this championing. I mean, we saw it in the White House yesterday, right? The fact that they had this really intense political discussion about the future of the trade relations between South Africa and the US and geopolitical discussions at large, that it was not a round table behind closed doors. There were cameras everywhere. There were people fighting for attention.
Well, that's just what we saw. We could have very much been round table behind closed doors discussions.
They probably were and are going to be behind closed doors discussions, but it's the theatrics of it all that, I mean, I know people who could not tell you who the deputy president of this country is, like texting me last night being like, are you watching this? Because people are watching it for show and spectacle, and we need to bring back boring politics. I need Thabo Mbeki-esque boring politics needs to be where we go as a nation, because when you do everything for show and spectacle, and this is also another thing, is that politicians and the way political spectacles are put on, specifically to engage voters, I don't think that we as a nation have enough political discernment to look between what is fact and what is fiction. You know, Fasiya Hassan's speech in Parliament is a really good example of that. calling for an investigation for those MPs' trips to Israel, saying, we feel so strongly, how could they go against the Constitution? Like, it was a really emotion-evoking speech that went quite viral. It was getting posted all over social media. I would almost be 1,000% certain that she, in her personal capacity, does not feel so strongly convicted that she cut ties with all those MPs who went on that trip. She's still talking to them in Parliament. She's still having working relationships with them, because that is how politics works. But on the ground, as it filters down specifically towards young South Africans, and I've seen this firsthand, how young South Africans take politics so personally. They feel these personal political convictions deep in their soul, and it shows in the online hatred that we now see.
The personal is political, but there's a difference between what I find personal for personal enjoyment or entertainment to the personal of that the macroeconomics affects how much I pay for a litre of petrol, and that's going to influence how much I pay for a loaf of bread. Politics is personal, but currently you arguing the way it's consumed, it's not the substantive personal impact of policy and politics on people's lives that people are interested in.
No, and yesterday was a phenomenal example of this, where, the budget, especially Budget 3.0, is extremely important to the way we navigate the fiscal future of South Africa and how it is going to affect everyday South Africans. But if you had to look at the number of people who watch the budget, who have engaged with the budget, the number of people when the documents open up for public comment, who will comment on the fiscal framework or the bills, people who will engage with that, even though it affects their bottom line, compared to people who watch Donald Trump versus Cyril Ramaphosa just for the sheer spectacle of it all. I think it is extremely concerning, because there was definitely a time in South African politics where South Africans as a whole were really engaged in politics. Political books were selling, specifically around the state capture area. We were looking at how engaged South Africans were when it came to the political future. I just don't think we have that anymore.
But Cyril and Trump in the White House was a political World Cup. It's a political World Cup where, again, people who have no interest in geopolitics were watching because we could relate to a South African or a South African team, because Dr. Rassie Erasmus says it's not always about the most talented player, it's what that player can contribute to the team. And so, Ernie Els Retief may not have been the most talented of players, but they were part of the team. And maybe that's why South Africans, who weren't interested before in geopolitics, were interested, because it was South Africans representing on the international scale. We need a patriotic bourgeoisie.
I think South Africans were watching because they wanted to laugh. I don't think that if you had to ask South Africans to be what were they actually discussing? What was the intent of the trip? Walk on the street and ask someone, what does AGOA stand for? They don't know. And I'm just saying, and I fight, the personal is political, and not everything needs to be made political, but I do think we do need to get back to a stage where we are engaging with politics in a meaningful manner, and it's not just for laughs. Cyril should have taken Rassie to the White House.
No, some people have put Helen should have gone.
Helen, yeah, I agree.
But Donald Trump does not care about Helen Zille. He does not care about Rassie Erasmus. He does not care. Gosh, if we could reanimate Nelson Mandela, he wouldn't have cared, because he's the crying baby who wanted his toys, and that is other millionaires and golfers. That spoke to that moment.
My dream delegation, Rassie should have been there. I think so. Peter Groenewald should have gone as well. Gayton should have been there.
No.
Gayton should have been there. All the leaders with inside the GNU, they should have all been there. And they should have all sat on that couch with a united front.
Why should Gayton have gone?
Just for fun.
For fun, exactly. For fun.
They
no
needed to
substantive policy.
I would have loved to have seen Gayton argue with Donald, though. I would have paid to see that. Because Gayton models himself off of Trump. And so to have the two of them fight against each other.
Yeah, look, connected is the pandering to the similar rhetoric of Donald Trump, and that was migration. Zukiswa Lose, the Kasatu president, I thought she was the best speaker, but because she was black and she was a woman, I don't think
Trump didn't listen.
He didn't listen at all, but I think she had probably the the best contribution, even though I disagreed with some of her comments on the impact of uncontrolled migration to South Africa. So there are plenty of things in each individual speaker's contribution that I have critiques on. But overall, it was a contribution by a team which I think moved the needle.
The team and the United Strand, I do think, moved the needle a lot. The fact that John Lamola did not say anything was actually quite shocking to me, especially as our Minister of International Relations. I do think that
because Rubio wasn't there, so he didn't have a counterpart.
But I do think, I mean, if Naledi Pandor was there, I think she would have put Donald Trump in his place.
But would that have benefited the national interest?
Did last night benefit the national interest?
I think it did. I think it moved sufficiently that I think there was a tacit agreement between Donald Trump and Cyril Ramaphosa that this is theatre.
What is going
this
to
is
move?
All made up.
I think it was good for views and likes and clicks. I think it definitely boosted Cyril's popularity. What I think will move the national interest is the conversations we will not be privy to. And then a week from now, the presidency will drop a media notice to say, this is the new trade agreement that is going to happen.
Who is your next politician who should be roasted?
I would love, this is not going to happen, but I would love to see the roast of Julius Malema. Because I think the comebacks he would give to everyone else who sits on the panel would be really interesting. But yeah, I would love to see the roast of Julius.
Okay.
John had, no, I can't make that comment, never mind.
Look, John performed so well, UCT should give him an honorary BA.
An honorary.
Just for saying thank you, country duty.
Who is your politician that needs to be roasted?
It would be, in terms of cabinet ministers, it would be Pieter Groenewald.
Okay.
Simply because I think, look, he's a worm. Worms can give as much as they take, and I've said this over and over, and I've said this to Pieter Groenewald, I said this to Pieter Groenewald. I would not vote for the Freedom Front Plus. Nothing within your manifesto, your policy speaks to me, but I appreciate your presence in a National Assembly, because even though I'm so very far from their political views, I appreciate them because they've agreed to play by the rules that was negotiated in the form of a South African constitution. They play by those rules, they participate by those rules, and I appreciate them more than someone who wants to stand outside the parliamentary dome and wants to pee in.
Fair point.
And that's our show. We're back
See you next week.
next week again for The Bull. Have a good one.